Through my window. When I work with the mass spectrometer in my laboratory at the clinic, I often pause to look through the window near my desk. Last summer, bluebirds and goldfinches and a pair of nesting orioles often caught my eye. One evening in the fall, after the corn was harvested, I watched 6 deer, a red fox, and a skunk forage through the field all at one time. On the first warm day of spring, the window was open, and I heard the calls of wild geese and stopped to watch their high northward flight. I have watched the sun rise over the field in all seasons. After long, worried nights at work because of a sick child, I especially like to watch Jake Stoltzfus, where his son-in-law work in the field with a team of mules. Jake and Sam plow, plant, and harvest with 4 small red mules. You may think, such a contrast. The work of a doctor, analytical chemistry, biochemistry, efforts to understand how an inherited disorder injures the brain of an infant, all within 100 feet of an Amishman's field work with mules. Such a contrast. You say, yes, I say, but these people and their way of life has much to teach us. I have come to respect the labor in the field. Jake worked this land for 30 years, and last year his young son-in-law took over the farm. The field helped Jake and Naomi feed 12 children, gave them all, taught them all meaningful work. The work there also fed many generations of livestock, and at the same time fed many generations of wildlife. The field was cleared more than 100 years ago. The Amish people have worked the fertile land around the clinic for 300 years with the same simple, low-cost, labor-intensive, high-yield methods of farming. Last spring, as I walked through the freshly plowed field, I found a flint arrowhead and was reminded that before Amishmen, the woodland was harvested in another way by another people. History and timelessness come through my window in like spring air and sunlight, like calls of wild geese, to remind me that my work here too takes its place in time. When Jake's mules turn at the end of the row, he often looks to see if I'm at my window and waves. We each respect the work of the other. He knows I measure the usefulness of my work against the usefulness of his. He knows that I measure the success of my work not in terms of lectures or publications or grants or income, but in terms he understands. He has grandchildren with the disease that I study, and we hope they can work in the field someday. Spring 1994, through my window. Part of the reason I'm here today is because of that essay. There were a collection of stories and essays that came out of that time that went around the world in 36 different languages. And we still have a nice collection of letters from people around the world about that series of stories and about this notion that what we do in Lancaster County in this little clinic is meaningful work. So in parts, that's what this lecture is about. Now, I realize that I'm talking to biology students and professors, and I do want to talk about some of the biochemistry of the disorders that really brought me to Lancaster County, that interest me as a physician and as a biochemist and as a biologist. But behind that are these ideas about meaningful work, the special child, the biology of these diseases and why they're important and interesting. And that's really, in part, what I want you to take away from the lecture. I'll tell you about maple syrup urine disease and glutaric aciduria and propionic acidemia if we have time. But you won't go away knowing how to manage those diseases. You'll just have some sense of how we think about those. We have a daughter who dates a young man who now teaches organic chemistry at Washington Lee University in Lexington, and he thinks it's essential that physicians know organic chemistry I've never been so sure about that. But I will try to convince you that there is useful information in those pathways that you dislike and memorize and then forget. Experience and insight, caring for the patient in the time of genomics. Small science in a medical home, the clinic for special children. And I've chosen for this part of the lecture here to talk about 4 disorders, biochemical disorders, that you can look up in your Linenger or whatever biochemistry textbook you use. MCADD, which is medium chain deficiency, GA1, which is glutaric aciduria, which is the disease I really came to Lancaster County to study, maple syrup urine disease, and propionic acidemia. But some of the ideas that we talk about are actually harder than the biochemistry. I think it's important to understand that much of the work that we're able to do comes from the support of the community that we work for. And you have to appreciate the fundamental importance of the value that is placed upon the children that we care for. Another essay that's in that collection of essays called Through My Window is Death and Life, the death of Enos Fisher. And I talk about going down to pronounce this child dead, which is part of the job. He had a lethal disorder. And I talk about what it was like to walk into the house that was lit by a lantern, and then what the room looked like with a lantern hanging above the bed. And then a few years later, our daughter took those images and painted this picture. And I had put that story into another collection of essays, and I ended this story like this. As I looked back into the house, I remembered the children at play on the deathbed and what the grandfather said. His few words would change the way those children and I would remember the life and death of the boy. I understood that the gathering in the room was not only a ceremony about death and life and after death, but was the means by which the family would endure and be strengthened by the loss of the child. That was the boy's gift to his family and to all those who knew him. Special children hope to suffer less and lead fulfilled lives through the help of others. Within their families and communities, they are not merely the object of compassion and love, but are often the very source. Such children shape the Amish Mennonite cultures and inspire work such as that at the clinic in important and forceful ways. We should not underestimate the value of their lives, however brief and however difficult. We should not assume the plain cultures or our own cultures would be better off without them. These special children are not just interesting medical problems, subjects of grants and research, nor should they be called burdens to their families and communities. They are children who need our help, and if we allow them to, they will teach us compassion. They are children who need our help, and if we allow them to, they will teach us to love. If we come to know these children as we should, they will make us better scientists, better physicians, and thoughtful people. When we give these talks, we always talk about why this work is so interesting. Why is the work we do in Lancaster County with these children with unusual problems of great interest, not only to the families and to us as their local physicians, but in biology, in thinking about these diseases as biological problems? And I often use this quote from William Harvey: "There's no better way to advance the proper care of medicine than to give our minds to the discovery of the unusual law of nature by careful investigation of cases of rarer forms of disease." William Harvey, 1657. And that statement's just as true today as it was in 1657. Another note. Scientists who work as physicians and care for many patients with the same genetic disorder over long periods of time develop a different understanding of the genetic disease than scientists who study the disease mechanism in cell cultures in the laboratory. It is often through the daily work of a physician caring for a patient that new opportunities for treatment are realized. The everyday practice of medicine is a frontier for translational genetics. The medical care of a child with a genetic disorder is no different than the care of a child with other complex medical problems. Diabetes mellitus, depressive illness, rheumatoid arthritis, seizures, and many other chronic problems come to mind. As with the majority of diseases treated by physicians, there are a few perfectly treatable genetic disorders. Nonetheless, improved understanding of disease mechanisms combined with accessible and effective medical care can often decrease suffering, improve function, reduce dependency upon others, and otherwise limit the effect of disease, genetic and acquired, upon the life of the patient. The understanding, the acceptance of the fact that many common illnesses arise from genetic predispositions but are nonetheless treatable may ultimately be the most important contribution of the plain communities and our clinic for special children to translational genomic medicine. When I was a fellow in Philadelphia, the Division of Metabolism had 6 full-time physicians who took care of children with metabolic diseases. The group followed 157 patients. Richard Kelly, who I'd come from Boston to work with, followed 87 of those patients. In that group of 157, there were only 10 patients from the plain communities, which by then were famous because of McCusick's work in Lancaster County, The Medical Genetic Conditions of the Amish, published in 1978. I'll talk about that more tonight. There were 10 children from these communities who had classical maple syrup urine disease. Today, from those populations, 2 pediatricians, Kevin Strauss and me, follow 2,300 children with 125 different recessive disorders. One question that comes up is, were these populations underserved? Turns out that 433 of the children that we see at the clinic came to us through newborn screening. Is it a good idea to test all newborns for certain genetic diseases? Is that a new idea? I asked the students here who may not have had their own children yet who got jagged in the heel for that PKU test that everybody talks about. When did that start? In the 60s. The state of Pennsylvania actually led the expansion of newborn screening using a technology called tandem mass spectrometry. That expansion took place solely through the efforts of Edwin Naylor, who set up a lab in Pittsburgh, a private lab, and brought modern technology to newborn screening. We now screen for 55 disorders on that little heel stick using very modern, rapid technology. And all of these patients, in contrast to the 10 we took care of, all of these conditions are diagnosed from the plain communities. Now, 433 patients, that's a lot compared to what we had in the division when I was there. And some of these we didn't know about at all, like Propionic Acidemia that I'll tell you about, that caused a lot of morbidity and mortality in the Amish and the Mennonite populations, and we didn't know about it. It was not seen until we started newborn screening. And people say, well, that's a lot of patients and that's a lot of disorders, but if you look at the top there, you'll see there are only 6 Mennonite disorders out of those 55, and there are 8 Amish disorders out of those 55. So one of the important messages in this is that, yes, there are certain troubles, like maple syrup urine disease, that are more common in the plain communities, or glutaric aciduria in the Amish population. But these disorders are selectively increased We are very fortunate at the clinic. We only have to think about 125 of the more than 5,000 human recessive disorders. The populations were established by founders who selected certain genes from Europe, and those genes are distributed in the population in a very uneven way, and they were selected from the European genes circulating in Central Europe at that time in a very uneven way. So, for example, yes, maple syrup urine disease is much more common in the Mennonites than in the general population, but it doesn't exist in the Amish. Nobody from the Amish community brought that gene into the population. Propionic Acidemia is pretty common in the Amish, but we don't see it in the Mennonites. Cystic fibrosis, which is the most common disorder in the general population of Europe and the United States, is not seen in the Lancaster County populations at all. The gene actually happens to be there. The gene mutation that causes that is there. We see it when we do exome sequencing. It's just there at very low frequency. Part of our advantage at the clinic is that we take an interest in the populations we serve, and we remember the cases. We have catalogs of disorders. It's very easy for us to recognize most of the conditions we see. We have all of the technology at the clinic we need to do that. It's a tremendous advantage for us as physicians. We only have to worry about 125 disorders. When I practiced in Philadelphia, I had to worry about all 5,000 of them. And we didn't have the technology that we have at the clinic. Now, this is another list of disorders, and I titled this, Other Inherited Disorders Found Within the Plain Population for Which Treatment and Outcomes Justify the Diagnosis in the Pre-Symptomatic Infant by Family, Targeted Carrier Testing or Newborn Testing. And these are just disorders for which there's not the technology currently to do statewide or population-wide screening. But all reasonable people would agree that diagnosing these conditions and treating them early would improve outcomes, would allow better medical care. And again, within the populations we serve, we can easily do these tests. The last time we diagnosed Crigler-Najjar disease, which is a disorder of bilirubin metabolism, we got the molecular diagnosis confirmed by Eric Puffenberger and Adam Heaps before we got the bilirubin back from Lancaster General. We can draw a blood sample, extract the DNA, do targeted mutation selection in less than 2 hours. Unimaginable when I was a fellow. One of the most important things that has happened in my career is the expansion of knowledge in genetics and genomics that came with the Human Genome Project. And I hope that all of you in biology every day use the NCBI databases and understand what an incredible public resource that is. Phenomenal. When I first heard that Victor McKusick and others were advocating for sequencing the human genome, I thought, that'd be interesting, but it's not going to affect what I do. Well, I admit every lecture that I was very wrong. We use that database every day. Phenomenal. Phenomenal resource. Another part of the job is taking care of children who have lethal disorders. All physicians who practice and actually take care of patients are going to take care of people with lethal disorders. And over the 20 years, 25 years that I've been in Lancaster County, I went through and calculated how many patients we had with these disorders that are invariably lethal. Is that helpful to know that? To be able to diagnose for $50 or by physical exam a condition that invariably causes the children to waste away? What happened to those children before the clinic? Oh, they got $30,000 or $40,000 workups, MRIs, nerve conduction studies, muscle biopsies. Now, almost all of these we can see when we walk in the room. The children have those. We can do the molecular confirmatory test that takes 2 hours, and then we can talk about the research that's being done. Chicken breast disease, the Amish call it troponin myopathy. It's one of the most common disorders found in the Lancaster County population. I've seen about 85 children with that disease. JP Gin who's from China, muscle physiologist, works in University of Chicago, has spent 10 years in his laboratory trying to figure out how to manipulate the expression of troponin to replace the gene that's defective. JP's dedicated. He will eventually find an answer to that. In the meantime, we, as pediatricians, take care of those children. Part of our work. So now for the metabolic disorders. Newborn screening. The little boy on the far left, who is now about 6'4", great basketball player, goes to Millersville University, was born in about 1994, right after Naylor's newborn screening program started, and he was identified with MCAD, medium-chain acyl dehydrogenase deficiency. At the time, it was probably the only disorder in the long list of disorders being tested for through Naylor's lab that all pediatricians could agree should be tested for in every child. It's a common disorder in people of European descent. This child is neither Mennonite or Amish, Pennsylvania Dutch maybe. So he was born, and when I talked to the pediatrician there in Lancaster, I said, anything unusual about the family history? Well, there was this girl who died of SIDS. And by the way, that happened after she got her first set of immunizations. So could we tell if she had the same disease? Yeah, we just got the filter paper out of the warehouse, analyzed it. She also had MCAD. She died because of a prolonged period of fasting associated with a fever and a response to an immunization. Poor nursing, was found dead in the morning. There was a big investigation. Was this vaccine related? Did she have some other problem? A fatty liver was noted at autopsy, but she was ultimately assigned out as SIDS. About 5% of sudden infant death in the United States is attributed to these fatty acid oxidation defects that we now routinely screen for. When I was a fellow, the children with that disease had a 30% mortality with their first illness. They would come to the emergency room, unresponsive, seizing, hypoglycemic. By the time you sent off some labs to find out what may be the matter with them, which never came back in time, they were gone. Now, we've always been interested in why this disorder limits the capacity to fast. We know a lot about that now, but we don't really know much about why they become encephalopathic and die. That kind of study has not advanced very far in the past 25 years, but now none of these children die. Just because we know it, we pick them up in newborn screening. We can counsel the parents to avoid fasts of more than 8 or 9 hours. If they start vomiting, they come down to the hospital, they get some IV ginger ale. It's just IV glucose, same concentration as ginger ale. So if you educate parents that they need 100 cc's every hour to replace that IV, most of the time you can keep them out of the hospital. It's a benign disorder. Benign disorder. Now, maple syrup urine disease. This is a little more complicated. When I was a fellow, 55% of the children with maple syrup urine disease died of cerebral edema, brain swelling. They lived in Lancaster County. They were all Mennonite. They would become ill with some common illness. Over a day or so, they would become increasingly lethargic. Finally, you couldn't get them to respond. So they were driven into Philadelphia to the emergency rooms. About 12 hours later, they would herniate from cerebral edema and die, 55% by age 5. Even those diagnosed as newborns because of siblings. Of those that survived, most were in wheelchairs. None of them went to school with their brothers and sisters. They were handicapped children with poor outcomes. Now, if you read the literature about newborn screening back then, the American Academy of Pediatrics will say, we only believe in screening for those disorders that are highly treatable. At the time we started screening for MSUD, the mortality was 55% and the outcomes were terrible. IQs were average of 70. Most children were disabled. How has that changed? Well, this is the way the biochemists think about this problem. This is what you get in your classes, that pull a figure out of Linenger. So valine, isoleucine, and leucine undergo a transamination. They give the ammonia group to alpha-ketoglutarate to form glutamate. And then the ketoisocaproic, or the keto acid, is acted on by this branched-chain ketoacid dehydrogenase that pulls a CO2 group off, and then the amino acid is degraded. This is the excess amino acid taken in our diet. At the top there, I've written out the mutation that is found in the Mennonites, which is a T to A change in exon 9, position 1312. I had to write that out because I never remember that, much to Eric Puffenberger's chagrin. I just don't remember that. Because to me, as a pediatrician, you will never understand the natural history of this disease. You will never understand what it takes to change the outcome by looking at that figure, by looking at the enzymology, or by looking at the gene mutation itself. There's no insight there. And what I want as a pediatrician, I want the insight. I want to know what the natural history of the disease is. Why do people develop cerebral edema and herniate? Why are they retarded? Why are they in wheelchairs? And what happens when they get a cold or an ear infection or vomiting and diarrhea and decompensate? Well, in some sense, the disease can be understood by the fact that whenever anybody comes ill with this, neonate or later on, they come in with very high levels of leucine, branched-chain amino acid. Look that up. Branched-chain amino acid. Leucine is very intoxicating to the nervous system. When your leucine level gets up around 3,000, you're not doing any arithmetic in your head. You're usually not awake. It's very intoxicating. And the rescue of a newborn with MSUD is part of the job, right? They come into the hospital, used to come into the hospital in coma, very high levels, ketoacidotic, and we would rescue them. Well, the simple principle is that you lower the leucine by getting control of metabolism and forcing the body to make protein. 10% of all human protein is leucine. The rate at which protein is synthesized predicts exactly the rate at which leucine level comes down. So all you have to know is enough biochemistry and endocrinology to figure out how to control that. So if you go to a textbook of endocrinology, it will tell you that the systems that control protein metabolism and protein catabolism are these. Those are the variables. So it took a few years, but we translated those into some very practical parameters. Now, if you were residents and learning about MSUD, we could spend the next hour on this page just talking about the variables that we use when we hospitalize a comatose child with MSUD and rescue them. This is what it takes to reverse catabolism. That means the body is breaking down protein and releasing this free intoxicating amino acid into the bloodstream. It gets into the brain and affects the function of the nervous system. And to rescue from that, you've got to put them back into the anabolic state, which means they just have to gain weight. So each amount of weight a child gains each day, 12.5% of that is new protein that goes into hemoglobin and muscle and hair and everything else that's protein. And 10% of that protein is leucine. And the rate at which the leucine level comes down is the rate at which you force them back into the anabolic state. Now, we've been very successful at doing that. When I was a fellow, most newborns who came in comatose were in hospital about at least 2 weeks. They often were in coma for a week. The average time of discharge in the comatose newborns we see is 4.5 days. By that time, they're drinking their formula, they're on therapy, and they go home. Now, the other thing we've been able to do, because we work in the population and we know the families and we can do carrier testing, Eric Puffenberger can do carrier testing, so we just do a lot of carrier testing. So if a family has a child who's at risk for MSUD, we get either cord blood or we get blood at 12 hours of age and find out if they have the disease and take care of them at home. So out of the 72 newborns we've taken care of in the last 20 years, half of them have been taken care of at home, and half still come in unrecognized except by newborn screening, and we rescue them. And they all survive, not had a death. They all go to school with their brothers and sisters. And now, ultimately, many have been cured. How do they get cured? Why would you think a liver transplant would cure MSUD? I'll talk about that in a minute. The most practical thing, though, we learned in Lancaster County is that most of the illnesses that caused cerebral edema and death were really common problems, infections, that provoked this metabolic, catabolic response, and that if you were going to manage children successfully, you had to work as real doctors taking care of people who had real infections and understand enough about their biochemical disorder and have the facilities to diagnose them, to understand their metabolism, and use that as part of your thinking. The clinic is the only clinic in the world, I would predict, where you can get your leucine level measured while you wait. Before the clinic was there, blood levels would be sent off from Lancaster to the labs in Philadelphia, and maybe the result would come back in 3 weeks. Now, anybody knows anything about managing diabetes, think about this. Sending off a blood sugar and waiting 3 weeks to adjust your insulin? Makes sense? Nothing made sense about the way this disorder was taken care of until the clinic was set up. And part of what we did was set up an amino acid analyzer in Jake's field and do rapid analysis and think about how infections disturb metabolic control and set up at Lancaster General Hospital a way to rescue children when they were sick. And you'll notice that many of the infections listed here, 78% of all hospitalizations are made necessary by ordinary things like gastroenteritis and pneumonias from RSV and ear infections and strep pharyngitis. And we also have appendicitis and cholecystitis and torsion of the ovary. There's surgical problems that lead to decompensations. And again, patients need a place where they can go, and you'll see that 90% of those illnesses require that kind of integration of general medical care and an understanding of the biochemistry. And I never asked Eric to redo the molecular biology. I know what the molecular biology is. What I need to know is the biochemistry and the natural history of the disease. We always go through this cost analysis when I talk to families and to doctors. Does it pay to immunize those children? Of course. Preventing infection through immunization is one of the fundamental things that we can do in our medical home to keep children with genetic disease of all sorts from becoming ill. And we can translate that very easily into cost savings for the community. This is rotavirus, Rototec, which causes vomiting and diarrhea. And if you just figure the cost for immunizing 50 patients or not immunizing 50 patients and how many days in the ICU they stay and what the cost is going to be, for those 50 patients, you save the community $128,000. And it turns out that many of the disorders that we see are that way. Glutaric aciduria, propionic acidemia, Kriegler-Najar, or medium chain deficiency, many of the other genetic disorders benefit by infection prevention, immunizations, and by having a medical home where people who are taking care of them who actually know what the disease is and what it does when you're sick. It seems like common sense, but it was not always widely accepted. What is cerebral edema? Now, you'll just have to take my word for it that the CT scans that I'm showing you there show a child with MSUD who is very close to dying. The top CT scan was done in a hospital that I won't mention, it was down in a southern state, and the father called me and they said, well, they're going to send Kervin home. They say, we can't really do anything here for him that you can't do at home. And I said, well, let me tell you, you're going to go home. He's going to keep vomiting. He's going to get sicker and sicker. And you're going to get in a van and drive to Lancaster County, and I want to know before you leave how tight that brain is. So you tell him you're not leaving until Morton gets his CT scan. So they did the CT scan at the top. They did get in the van the next morning, drive to Lancaster County, and as soon as he came through the doors of the hospital, carried by his father, we did another CT scan, and that's about as close as I've seen to herniation with MSUD. Now, it happened at that time there was a woman named Kim Soo from South Korea, who takes care of all the South Koreans with MSUD, and she wanted to see how we take care of maple syrup urine disease. And it just happened that she came through the door the same day Kervin came through the door, and she got to witness his resuscitation. And she was so struck by his recovery. This is 2 days later. We have reversed the cerebral edema. Well, how do we do that? We could spend a long time talking about how MSUD causes cerebral edema, disturbs the osmotic regulation of the nervous system. It is essentially, from the medical point of view, the management of excess vasopressin, which causes the body to hold on to water, its effect on the kidney, and causes the brain to take up excess water. So essentially, our strategy, our management, is to prevent the osmotic effects of water influx into the nervous system until we have the MSUD under control. And it takes a combination of a drug called mannitol, which pulls water out of the brain, furosemide, which blocks the water concentrating effect of the kidney, and hypertonic saline to prevent them from getting hyponatremic. And as the children recover, they will say, I'm having trouble concentrating on television. Can you give me another dose of mannitol? And it's amazing how much that change in osmolarity affects their mental status. It's amazing to see them recover from this condition that they used to die from. Mental retardation with MSUD. MSUD is one of those diseases that really could teach you everything about medicine and biology, I think. It turns out that the leucine, isoleucine, and valine and 5 other amino acids get into the brain in association with a transporter. Now, there are 2 interesting things about this protein that pulls the amino acids in the nervous system. First, it was described by a biochemist named Halvor Christensen back in the 50s. He was one of the great biochemists of this country and Europe. He was sent to Europe after World War II to sort of educate the German people, the German scientists, about all the biochemistry that they had missed during the war. He was really a dominating figure in biochemistry. He was University of Michigan. He was nominated for the Nobel Prize for this work in 1963 by Charlie Scriber from Canada. And essentially, Christensen just described this transport system that shows that leucine, isoleucine, valine, threonine all are concentrated in the blood very close to the transport maximum for this protein, and they compete with each other to get into the nervous system. And the translation of that is when leucine is high, tyrosine and tryptophan and valine, all important amino acids for neurologic function, don't get in. They're blocked out. Now, that's been known for a long time. Seymour Kaufman at National Institutes of Health had tried for years to get people who work with a disease called PKU to pay attention to Christensen's work. And there was a brilliant guy named Quentin Smith who finally took all of Christensen's calculations and turned them into an animal model, studied this. And then, in 1996, there was a medical student named Kevin Strauss who came to the clinic and brought these equations to me and said, I think these are interesting in regard to MSUD. And from 1996 on, we have used these equations to understand the influx of amino acids into the nervous system and the neurologic symptomatology associated with intoxication of leucine. It's been a phenomenally fertile finding. And at one point we tracked down Halvor Christensen, who was about 85 years old, living in San Diego, talked to him about what we were doing, got him and his wife on an airplane to come out, and he came to the clinic. Quentin Smith came to the clinic. Doug Wilmore, who's a trauma surgeon from the Brigham Hospital in Boston, who is very interested in MSUD because of its metabolic information, what it taught us about metabolism. So we had this neat conference at the clinic talking about using old Christensen's equations to understand this disease. And by the end of it, he said, I think I'll get you guys, he says, nobody's really paid any attention to my work for a long time. I think I'll get you guys to write my obituary. And I said, well, we would rather nominate you for another Nobel Prize. He died a few years later, but he did really appreciate the fact that we took what he learned and translated it into some very practical work. This little baby came from Amsterdam. Actually, the most remarkable thing was she was sent by an insurance company in Holland because they couldn't get her out of the hospital. She was losing her hair. She had this terrible rash. She wouldn't eat. She was anemic. They had to transfuse her, and she had MSUD. So this is a case in Holland, MSUD, and she had all these problems. And as soon as she came through the door in the hospital, I knew immediately what the problem was. You see, if you look across that histogram there, there's a VAL, that's valine. Valine has a very low affinity for old Halvor Christensen's transport system, and when leucine is higher than valine in the blood, almost no valine gets into the nervous system. I showed this to Quentin Smith, and he says, well, you don't really have to be Quentin Smith to see what the problem is there. So we did a reasonable thing, which was to give her a lot of valine, and you can see from that top graph how much her blood valine level went up. And then in the bottom graph, you can see how her head started to grow. Worldwide, the most common error in the management of MSUD is low valine. It is one of the metabolites that's not handled normally in MSUD, but it's not toxic. It's a whole lot more important biologically when valine is deficient and can't get in the nervous system than when valine is high. On the left there, you'll see what the fine dendritic branching of the surface of the brain looks like in a patient who's chronically valine deficient. That picture is the most common cause worldwide of mental retardation. That is actually the picture of kwashiorkor. So isolated valine deficiency in MSUD is essential amino acid deficiency that leads to kwashiorkor. These are important and interesting diseases biologically. You can learn a lot. And you can change the outcome. So our oldest patient with MSUD is now about 45 years old. She was born in 1967. She was semi-comatose for months, had frequent and prolonged seizures. She did not regain her birth weight for 16 weeks. We usually like them to regain their birth weight in a week or two. At age 45, she's spastic, mentally retarded, and fully dependent upon others for daily care. Her niece was asymptomatic with MSUD when she was sent home from Ephrata Hospital in the low-risk discharge program, came by the clinic, we tested her, she had MSUD, we put her on formula, sent her home, I made a couple house calls, and she's had one hospitalization in about 18 years. Perfectly normal child, goes to school with her brothers and sisters. And I show this, I always say, one of the nice things about being the rabbit of an MSUD child is you don't get eaten. Rabbit meat is high in leucine too. Now, motivation. This is a picture of the disease as I saw it when I went to Lancaster County. Can you imagine preventing that? What's the value of that? So, another one of those stories. Susie told me the death of Sylvan was especially hard for Amos. He had become Amos's child. He was 6 months old when he became helpless. It happened so fast. He had a cold. In the morning, he had a fever, and at noon, I put him down for a nap, and he seemed okay. But when I got him up at 3 o'clock, he was helpless. He was limp. Couldn't hold his head. Could no longer sit or take a bottle. I was young then, and by then Levi was helpless, and Elmer had to be cared for too, and there was not anything I could do but ask Amos to take care of Sylvan. He fed him, got up at night for him, and even when Sylvan was small, Amos took him to the barn to do the milking, and to the fields on the plow and the hay wagon. He was Amos's child. And I go on, this is a story that's in this collection called Amos's Child. And I go on to talk about the death of this child who was very similar to the girl pictured here. The day after Sylvan died was the great snowstorm of 1978. We didn't know if we would be able to bury him, but the men worked hard to get the road open to the cemetery and the grave dug, and we buried him while the snow blew over us, and it was very cold. Not long ago, when I drove through that part of the country to make a house call, I stopped at the cemetery where Sylvan is buried. I could imagine him the day of the burial, the snow falling, blowing, covering the headstone, covering the fresh earth from the grave, falling into the grave and onto the horses and carriages along the fence. I could see people in black walk past the coffin. I could see the blue-white face and hands of the dead boy, and the snow fell on his face and hands and did not melt. And I thought, my work really began there, 10 years after I came to Amos's door. Even before I was a doctor, the work began with the life and death of an Amish boy who had become his father's child. Butyric aciduria. Ruthie died last year. She was 40 years old, weighed 40 pounds. She was disabled at age 6 months. Sarah painted this painting. She said that when she stayed with Ruthie's family, which she often did in the early days of the clinic, and they said the evening prayers, she said she always noticed that Ruthie looked up while everybody else looked down during prayers. So she painted this from the perspective of the angels, I guess. Now, through my window, Jake's got 2 grandchildren. On the left and the right are those 2 grandchildren. And in the middle is a boy who would have been called cerebral palsied, who also has butyric aciduria, all 3 of them. This is the kind of data pediatricians like to see. It's not hard to see that the outcome is good. It was actually very remarkable that early on we were able to have an effect upon outcome with this disease. Many physicians work for years and years before they have any success in treating a neurologic condition like butyric aciduria. It is a stroke. It always happens before 18 months of age. It often happens in the context of a common illness. And it destroys a part of the brain called the basal ganglia. This little boy who is distorted here has extremely severe dystonia. He gets all of your jokes in English. His first language is Dutch. He's learned English by listening. He's very bright. He's just disabled by this terrible disease. Now, on the left, when I went to Lancaster County in 1988, 95% of the children were disabled. There was 1 girl out of 20 who had escaped the critical period. Once the brain matures and people sit up and walk, these strokes don't happen. So there was a limited period of risk, which to a person like me as a metabolic doctor really was a challenge. Well, what is that? What's the maturation? Why are they protected? And most of all, how can we understand what happens during that episode of illness that leads to the disability? To me, it was going to be a treatable condition from the day I saw the first child in June of 1988. The natural history of this story told me it was treatable. We just had to figure out how to treat it. Now, I've said a lot of things about butyric aciduria that were wrong. And you learn to live with that. But one of the most important things I ever said was we will never treat this disease unless we commit to taking care of and finding the healthy newborn. That's why newborn screening was done in Pennsylvania at the clinic first from urine samples collected by midwives and grandmothers and anybody else who would get urine for us. And those 2 girls, Jake's grandchildren, were among the first diagnosed with that urine-based newborn screening program. And then Naylor's program that used tandem mass spectrometry came on in '93, and everybody got mad at us, Naylor and me, because we added glutaric aciduria to the screening program, and we didn't know how to treat it. I didn't know how to treat it. I'd had some success, but what I knew for sure was we would never win that battle of treating that disease unless we started with a healthy child. Now, you can see that between 1990 and 1994, we saved about 50% of children, which means we lost 50%. Difficult work. Between 1995 and 2000, we got up to about 2/3 success rate. And then, from 2005 on, we've saved them all. How do we do that? It comes back to this transport competition stuff and to Strauss. You know, Kevin recognized that there's another transporter that gets the amino acid lysine into the nervous system. There's competition between lysine, arginine, and ornithine, very similar to the LAT transporter for MSUD. And we found out in 2005 from a group in Canada who had done autopsies on children who died of glutaric aciduria that Morton's model was wrong. I had a toxicologist model. I worked in a poison center for a while and liked that kind of work. And so my idea was that we had to prevent the glutaric acid that was being formed in the liver and muscle from getting into the nervous system. There was some toxicity there. And so my strategy was to limit the production of glutaric acid and limit its entry into the nervous system. And it's just like treating salicylate or aspirin poisoning. It worked. The therapies we used based upon that model saved 2/3 of the kids, but there was something the matter with it. We didn't understand it completely. And it was this insight from the paper in Canada that showed us that the concentrations of glutaric acid in the brain were 1,000 times higher than spinal fluid or blood. The glutaric acid was formed in the brain from lysine being taken up and then degraded in the nervous system itself. Completely changed our strategy for how we treat it. And to make a long story short, what we learned was that by making a formula, an amino acid mixture that was devoid of lysine and rich in arginine and ornithine, we could limit the uptake of lysine into the nervous system by these same set of calculations that we did with old Halvard Christensen's work, and that made the difference. We limited the accumulation of glutaric acid in the nervous system and limited its toxicity. This is a kind of a famous picture. It was in Time magazine, and that little girl on the table is the first non-Amish child diagnosed with glutaric aciduria with the Pennsylvania Newborn Screening Program. Does anybody really believe that this is only an Amish problem? If I see a child with glutaric aciduria from Texas, 25% of the time they have the Amish mutation. Why is that? That gene just came from Europe 300 years ago. It circulates all over the world. It's one of the most common mutations that cause glutaric aciduria, and glutaric aciduria is a very common cause of what people used to call cerebral palsy. All of these diseases that we work with are mimics of these common things like cerebral palsy, which is not a diagnosis at all. It's caused by many different things. Autism, not a diagnosis, many, many different etiologies. Seizures. The genetic basis of seizures is many and complex. This child did very well, was on a rocking horse when she was 16 months of age and fell off onto the floor, had a big seizure, and had a large intracranial hemorrhage and had a retinal hemorrhage. What does that suggest to pediatricians? Shaken baby syndrome, yes? Shaken baby syndrome. I got into thinking about the genetic diseases that mimic child abuse because of a case in Denver, Colorado in the early 90s. Same story, fell off a bed. Father was accused of abuse, ultimately turned out to have shaken baby syndrome. Now worldwide, if you search the literature, you'll find all sorts of papers about GA1 being a mimic of child abuse and cerebral palsy. Glutaric aciduria does something very unusual to spinal fluid circulation in the brain. These are all pictures of MRIs of children with glutaric aciduria. This boy in the bottom middle there that has this large cyst, he's walking around. He looks pretty good. We didn't operate on that cyst because we were afraid we would provoke the stroke. We waited until he was 2 years of age before we corrected that. This is what a small punctate retinal hemorrhage looks like in a child with Propionic Acidemia, which led to people assuming this was child abuse, which was ultimately not a good assumption. And then this is what Nikki's head looked like after her fall. That black rim along the left side of the brain there is blood from her fall. Minor head trauma, abnormal vascularity, abnormal circulation of CSF makes them very prone to intracranial hemorrhages after minor head injuries. We were very fortunate to get her through this without a basal ganglion stroke. This is what she looked like when she was about 8 years of age. She likes to do gymnastics, which drives me crazy. But she's a very healthy child. She's about 15 years old now. She not only was saved from disability by newborn screening, by work at the clinic, I am sure her father was saved a prison sentence for shaken baby syndrome. I've spent 10 years on the Attorney General's Review Board on child abuse because there are many genetic disorders that mimic abuse. I had promised Don that I would finish in time to have questions. And if I go on and tell you much about propionic acidemia, we're not going to have time for questions. So I'm going to just give you a concluding thought. Propionic acidemia is an interesting disorder, one, and we didn't know it was there when I was a fellow. It's found in the Amish Mennonite population. It's the same mutation. It's a European mutation. There's some residual activity. The newborns are not sick with it. In fact, it's often missed in newborn screening programs. And if you don't screen, they're always missed. The presentation of this disease in a teenager or young adult is sudden heart failure. Some of them go into emergency rooms in severe heart failure and go right to heart transplant. It's a terrible problem in North America among the plain people. And this mutation circulates throughout Europe and throughout North America in people who have no remembered relationship to the plain communities. Now we have, through the same kind of biochemical thinking that we did with MSUD and glutaric aciduria, we have reversed cardiomyopathy. We have prevented seizures. We have prevented strokes. You can use the biochemical understanding of how this disease affects the mitochondria to change its natural history. And I would argue that the most important ingredient of that change is a place where children are cared for called the medical home. Frost said home is the place where they have to take you in when you have to go there. For a lot of the Amish Mennonite people who don't do medicine that well, a medical home is the place where when you have to go there, they have to take you in and they know how to take care of you. So this evening I'll talk about whether our clinic is a model for other clinics in the plain communities of North America, but is it a model for how you can use the knowledge of genetics and even biochemistry to change the natural history of these diseases to make medical care more effective in terms of medicine and outcome, but also in terms of cost? Obviously, I think the answer to that is yes. Concluding thoughts. This comes from another of these essays, story really, called Croquet. And basically the story was that I went out to pronounce one of these children dead who had chicken breast disease, Troponin Myopathy. And then in the summer, the family asked us to come out and have dinner and remember this child. And then after dinner, we played croquet, which is a popular thing to do. And we played in this large field. And when it got dark, Jake just went out and got lanterns. And so there were about a dozen of us running around the field. Each of us had a lantern playing croquet. And I wrote this story thinking about what it would be like for somebody on a hill far away to watch that and try to figure out what we were doing. Concluding thoughts. This is the way this story ends. I have been told that special children are gifts from God. I have been told that special children are punishments from God. I have heard scientists and doctors refer to these children only in terms of their genetic defects, aloof and with no human insight, as though the life of a child can be reduced to such terms. My experiences have made me think in a different way about these children and their short and often difficult lives. I cannot say why these children come and go upon the earth, but I know that they change the lives of those who know them. Such children have been my most important teachers. I have learned more from them than I did from many instructors at Harvard Medical School who were by reputation great teachers. These children have reshaped time and again the way I practice medicine, both the science and the art of it. I have heard sermons by ministers about compassion. I have heard fine lectures about ethics and medicine, but no sermon or lecture has taught me as much as a single special child. These little children change the lives of whole communities in ways that last far beyond their brief lives. They are not merely the focus of compassion, but often its very source. Such children enrich the world in ways that many who are blessed with longer lives do not. They have much to give us, to teach us about themselves and about ourselves. I told Don when I was going to give this talk that I would put together a little booklet of some of these stories for those of you who wanted them. We decided rather than cut down a bunch of trees for a handout that was 150 pages long, that we would make that available at the Young Center website. So there is a collection of stories called Roads Taken that you can access there. Those of you who don't have access to the website, if you want to get in touch with me, I'll send you a hard copy, or we'll send you a hard copy through the Young Center. I had expected to finish this with a slide that's buried somewhere here. Let's see if I can get to it. This is the end plate from Martyr's Mirror. I'm sure many of the historians will recognize that. And this little poem that I like: I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the road less traveled by. And that has made all the difference. Thanks very much. I think we have time for a few questions. 5 minutes till 5. Not too bad, Don. Any questions, comments?
I have a question. In the spring, I teach a core course in human genetics, and we talk about phenylketonuria, maple syrup urine disease, and I know the children are put on the special diet within the first month or so. There's some debate, and I don't know if my text is wrong, you can probably tell me, is how long need to be on the diet. Some doctors say their entire life, others until the brain develops and they hit adulthood.
Yeah, the doctors who say that don't take care of them. Yeah, PKU, which is a kind of an indolent disorder of phenylalanine metabolism, is the same problem as MSUD. Phenylalanine has a very high affinity for the transporter, blocks the uptake of these amino acids that are essential for brain development and growth and function. A lot of those amino acids go into neurotransmitters. So the untreated PKU in adulthood is mental illness, mood disorders, seizures, dysfunction at many levels. It's not a benign disorder. MSUD is fatal if you go off diet. They simply do not survive unless you take care of it. And in that sense, it's a less forgiving disease, but in many ways easier to treat because people have to be compliant. PKU is kind of sneaky. It causes a lot of disability, is difficult to treat in adulthood, but nonetheless, good care results in better outcome. With MSUD, actually, we do liver transplants in part because finding adult care is so difficult. It's many of the teenagers and young adults who are electing to have liver transplants as a cure for that disease because they cannot find adult physicians to take care of them. And if they go to an emergency room with Mycoplasma pneumonia, which is the most common pneumonia in young adults, the chances of their dying by not being taken care of somebody who understands that disease is very high. Other comments, questions? Yes?
Do you see adult patients who may be in this category or only children under a certain age?
You mean in our follow-up clinic? It is one of the great needs of the Plain community is to have internists, family practitioners who take care of adults with genetic disease. We are pediatricians, there are only 2 of us. We are overwhelmed with pediatric cases. We do end up taking care of some of the adults with MSUD because we simply can't send them anywhere. One of our missions is to establish other clinics like ours that include care for special needs children and adults, and not only in Lancaster County, but in other places where the Plain people live. There are 200 communities in North America. Every community should have a clinic that takes care of those with special needs. It helps those with special needs who have a hard time finding medical care, but those kind of clinics become health centers. They influence care of the newborn. They make sure people get newborn screening. They get vitamin K. They help you transition into hospitals when you have congenital heart disease. They educate parents. They educate midwives. They educate everybody in the community about preventative health at all levels. So these clinics are, yes, they're interesting places from the point of view of medicine and biology, but they become very important resources for communities. It is a good investment for the Plain people to support them. It's a good investment for all of us to support them, but it's the Plain people who need them the most, at least from our perspective. I have a question for you, for those of you who might not come tonight. Now, there was a paper published not too long ago about 6,000 admissions to Rainbow Children's Hospital in Cleveland. These are pediatric admissions from regular old Americans, from that great general population that everybody talks about. What percentage of those admissions, when they were looked at by geneticists, were made necessary by a genetic predisposition to disease? What do you think? 5%? 10%? 40%? Regular old America now. 71%. 71%, and that was about 10 or 12 years ago when genetics was not as good as now. Of those children readmitted to hospitals from the general population for chronic care, 96% of them have genetic disease. Is the work that we do relevant to the care of children in the general population? Is genetics and medicine an important issue for general health care everywhere? Is our clinic a model of what needs to happen to integrate genomics into medical care? I'll answer that for you. It's yes. See you this evening. Thanks.